In this video, we're going to look at optimal line length, or line length of any particular line that we have. This is especially important. Actually, it's important in all typographic design. Any design that actually has a body text, a text where you're actually going to be reading quite a bit of copy. We call it text, we call it verbiage, we call it a little blurb, we call it copy, we call it any type. And that is our job as graphic designers, to make something readable, to make something not only readable, but more readable, or the best quality of reading we can give. And in this situation, we're kind of looking at maybe a magazine, a write-up, an editorial, potentially even thinking about a novel, how something might be written out, laid out to give it its most comfortable reading experience for the viewer, so that they can, read it without having any issues of, double reading a line, or the rhythm, a nice reading rhythm that takes them through the book and carries them. I'm sure we've read books and looked at things before, we found it very hard to read. Well, sometimes that is an issue with design, and we could always make things better. Now, just to go through a few issues here with line length that we are familiar with, and some things we might not be, but I'm here in InDesign, and we're just going to look at some ways, the issues of optimal line length in general, and then obviously ways to fix it, which is the most important thing there. So right off the bat, what I want to look at this line length. Here I have a line length that I've set on my page already, and if I go to my page and I click on off my preview, I see that I have some margins set up, and I think they're 1 inch margin, they're 1/2 inch margins all the way across. So we have to think about that too when we're set up in our initial document, is what is our margins. Our margins should be ideal if you're going to create a margin, create a grid, create some type of structure here, which you have to think about the margins. And normally margins, you want to give a fairly healthy margin to the outside and inside of the spine. These I put together as one long page just to give you an overall look. But the inside margin should be very good. The outside margin should be more. The top and bottom, it's kind of up to you, but the page should make sense. And there are obviously grids that are set up that are the most readable and very, very good, but in some situations you might not have that luxury. Either way, the margins will definitely help you create a structure, a grid structure. But in the meantime, I just really want to focus on line length right now, and then how we can play with that later. So right now, what I've done, a great tool in Photoshop and InDesign is called the info panel. And the info panel gives us some basic ideas, where I am, width and height. But the one I'm using the most right now is, I'm using the one, as I highlight something, I can see the amount of characters. So when we're talking about line length, we're talking about the amount of characters in one line. So the most readable part of that. So by looking and researching, we see that between 45 characters and 75 characters is the best optimal line length. So if we even dumb that down, we say between 60 is ideally your optimal line length. And what that means is that the amount of characters in one line should be between 45 and 75. If I see this line, which I've kind of already measured as 113, but this actually is 122, that's fine. That's really long. That's not good. So if someone's reading from here, and I've used lorem ipsum, obviously, just some placeholder text that you can find in any program. If I go all the way across and read, there's a good chance I'm going to come across eye strain, that I'm not going to be able to read it very well or read for very long. Number two, I'm probably going to double read and end up reading a line twice. Now, it's obviously a good thing that I have all my type left aligned and I have right ragged. If I were to do the opposite and say it was a right align left, now that's a little trickier, but in some areas people do read that way, which is totally fine. However, never have a large body of type being centered, because it's hard to read in terms of having to go back to a line. I'm reading here, then I go back and the line's here, then I go back and the line's here. So having a staggered edge for a large body of text is very, very difficult. So ragged left and right, not a good idea. So having a line where someone could actually read something and then go back to that line every time, it keeps it very easy for the reader to find where they need to go. That is makes it easier for the viewer to read. So that is obviously something we should keep in mind anyways. Now, with this being a long line length, not a good idea. So we've come across those issues. Now, if I go a step further, and once again, I've made the same margins I have, and now this time I split it up into 2 columns. I went to my layout and my margins and columns, and I set it up, and I changed it up a little bit here. If I actually click on this page, make sure I'm on that page, I can say that my margins and columns, I have 2. My gutter, the gutter is here. So this is the column, this is the gutter. You can obviously play around with the gutter, make it bigger, make it smaller. Obviously, if it's too small, the type will look like it's coming together. We need that separation. So you could even give yourself a healthier gutter to even spread it out even more. Now, if you give your gutter too much, then you might have some issues there. So it's kind of an optical thing. There is metrics involved where you can mathematically figure out what is best. But sometimes as a designer, optically, you'll have an idea of this works better. Just visually understanding the aesthetic, that I like this better because it just gives me more space or whatever. It's not too disconnected, it's connected enough. And you as a designer should be able to figure that out. Now, the thing is here, I have now split up the column structure. So now it's going to be easier to read. And look at this. This is 55. I put CPL, which is characters per line. So now if I measure that, it's about 55. And I think I tried to go with one of the longest lines, yeah, about 55. And this is going to be much easier to read. Number one, I don't have to go as far. So there's going to be less eye fatigue or eye strain. And then as soon as I'm done here, I come right back here, and I come right back here, and I come right back here. So 55 is good. So between 45 and 75 is ideal. So this is actually very comfortable reading right here. Okay, so that is kind of an ideal situation where we want to be, which is great. Now if I go one step further, and I'm going to show you obviously some not great ideas, but obviously what we're trying to get to the point is what is good and what isn't, and what doesn't work as well. I never like saying something is bad or good. I like saying something works better, something doesn't work as well, because there's always room for improvement. So if I look here, now this I split up into 3 columns. Okay, great. But now my current line length is about 33. Well, here I have about 40, so that's not horrible. So this isn't horrible, but it's not great. The way someone's going to read and have a nice rhythm here, you could feel and understand if you read it nicely, and if I understood this language, I would be able to read it and create a nice rhythm for myself as I read. Here, it's a little too staggered. It's a little too quick, and I might not like that quick staggered rhythm. So this one's a little too tight, and obviously that goes across. But look at this. I took, instead of using a 3-column structure, I actually took part of that 3 and more or less did a 2/3 structure. So a 2-column structure, but within a 3-column range. And now I've got a 75 character per line type box, text frame. And now actually we look at this, and this isn't that bad to read either. It's stretching it, but it actually isn't horrible to read. It's better than this, but once again, you might want to still condense it a little bit more. Now here we go even further, and once again, this rhythm was pretty, and this line length was pretty small, and now this is getting even worse, and it's going to be even harder to read. If I take off preview, we can see you're here, you're here, you're here, you're here. It creates a different type of rhythm to read, and it's almost a little too quick, and there are issues with that optimal line length. Now, if someone looks at this, they're like, oh wow, I could read that, that's actually fast, I could read that really fast. So maybe you want to have a small character per line length, but at the same time, this might not be as enjoyable. And then you're gonna have issues like this, and you're gonna have tons, a lot more hyphens which aren't as readable. If you have many hyphens connecting your type, if you go to your paragraph panel, and you could take off your hyphenation if you ever wanted to. In some situations you shouldn't, because it really messes with your line lengths, like this. Like that's very small, it's very short. It really messes with the ragged right, which really, this is actually not too bad. This is, it just makes it really, really hard to focus on the content and not the design, which really should be the case, where the viewer should be focusing on the content and not the design of it. But the design should just obviously be invisible. It should just be very good and easy to read. So this structure is not great either. But then what I did, I went on to use more or less an 83 character per line, using 3/4, so 3 columns in a 4-column grid. And once again, long, not as good, and we're coming close to this situation, which it's a little too much. So now I think you understand why we need to split up the content as opposed to just doing something like this. This, not only that, but if you're coming across a magazine editorial, say, and you see type like this, you're probably just going to pass it over. You're like, I don't want to read this huge block of text. But if you come across sections or partition text or modules, like here, read this, then read this, it's a little bit easier on the eye. The human brain will definitely want to compartmentalize and put this, okay, I read this and then I read this. That's easy. If I just look at this, I got to read this whole thing. So not only it's a little bit more engaging to break it up this way as well, and someone's going to want to read this over this, which is definitely notable. Now here I kind of put this together as well. I made a 12 column structure here with a very small margin, just to give you an idea of what this all is. So 121 characters per line, 113, 110, and I go down and down and down just to show you a rhythm that could be created and issues that come across. So obviously these ones are very long and hard to read. We've already explained that issue, but as I get lower and lower and lower and get to the point of between 45 and 75, so I'm looking here, 75, 65, 57, 42, roughly in this area, these ones are the most comfortable to read. They are one of the better ways to read. Once again, not only is it left aligned, right ragged, which is fine, and if you want to, like some people like to justify, now I'm not a big fan of justifying my type, even though it does create, let me do it here. It does create that a better look in terms of its structure. It's far more square and looking like this, and there are exceptions that how this works better and quite frankly looks better. Now once again, there are the issues with hyphens and how that looks, but I'm also not a big fan of the issues of the kerning and tracking and how all of a sudden this is actually one space, but it's a much bigger than this space, and obviously you could find rivers. Rivers are where you can all of a sudden you find a big chunk of white space that goes through the text, and that's never any good. Now there are ways around to fix that, but me personally, I don't even want to have to deal with that, quite frankly. I want to see if I find any rivers in here. They usually stand out, and what happens when they stand out is that they make it hard to read because the rivers are very visible and very visual, and you can see them and they break up, and once again they take you away from the content and make you look at the design, and that's definitely what we don't want to do that. So you always got to be careful. Like I said, I'm a big fan of left aligned, right ragged, but justification for justified type does have its purposes as well, but it's up to you to decide how you want to, if you want to use that, but at the same time it has its pros and cons as well. So once again, between 70, 77, 42, these are looking pretty good in terms of their line length and readability and all that. And I do have to mention here as well, I am using Garamond Premiere Pro. Regular 12 point is actually quite large to read. A good leading, which is the automatic leading. You know what, every time I do this too, it's always metric. I should already set my default to optical. I like optical spacing, kerning. It's just much, I don't know, I feel it's much nicer even when I'm making large headlines and titles, subtitles, headings, subheadings. I like it to be optical. The only time I make it metric is when I am using script typefaces, that should always be metric, never optical. It'll break up the script if you do it optically. The last thing I want to show you here is how we work with optimal line length if there is a concern. So once again, here I have two boxes inside of a 12 column frame. I have it so that these are ideally at a good line length, both of these columns, and one is Garamond Premiere Pro regular, and the other one is Helvetica new LT standard Roman. So just to give you an idea of obviously a sans serif and a serif. And the idea to, once again, when you start your design, it's good to have an idea of what typeface you want to start with, what you want to work with. You could obviously change the typeface prior to obviously settling on a specific design. You can go through many different serifs and sans serifs and whatever you like. Some are better than others. However, if there comes a situation, well, okay, I have my column structure. I have my margins exactly as I want them, which obviously this one is not very good. It's very limited. It's not a very good margin. It should be thicker. Either way, how do I make it so I need to bring this down? I really want this to be, or I want this to be closer to 60. So right now, say my optimal line length, I really want it to be more than 52. I want it to get closer to 60. Well, there's a way to do that, which a couple different ways to work with getting as close as we can to our optimal line length. So obviously we could lower the point size. Now, if we go too low, that's just going to be hard to read depending on what you're doing. If it's a magazine, people can move that up and closer to their face, especially we're talking about print production. We're also talking about websites and mobile devices, tablets, all that, where a website should have also keep in mind optimal line length, because people are reading a lot online, and there's the light emitting from the actual digital display, which is a different way people can read. And now the light's coming that way. Well, that's going to cause a different type of eye strain and a different type of readability, as opposed to light reflecting off of ink on a piece of paper, on a magazine, on a newspaper, on a book. That's a different type of readability. So we have to think about that as well. So we definitely have to think about how big our type is going to be. You never want to, me personally, I never want to go below 8.5. I just feel that's too small, depending on the publication, the printing, the website, whatever it is. And now there's a lot of accessibility, which is great on websites, where you can actually increase the size of the type yourself, which is great. However, that's not always the case, and maybe not always in that situation. And with a book or something printed, you definitely can't do that, obviously. So being a good designer and knowing that ahead of time, it's good to set yourself up so you're not going to have those issues. Either way, so here I played around with my point size, and now I've come to a situation where, okay, where am I at here? I'm at 71. No, that's not bad, 45 to 71. But I still feel this is going to be too small for somebody to read. So what I could do, I could just increase that. Let's just say 10. 10 is fine. 10 is not a bad reading size. Depending, once again, it all depends on the end result. What are you actually printing on? What are you designing? What website is this going on? How is it going to be seen? What is the end result? Which is always, always very important. Always keep in mind when you're designing. So right now, this is looking pretty good. I'm at roughly about, let's look at a decent line here, which goes all the way. I'm looking at 64. Now this, quite frankly, is as close as I can get to the best readability in terms of my line length. But we also have to keep a couple other things in play too. Not only my typeface, not only obviously the font that goes along with it, not only do I have to think about my type size, and obviously my leading. I could actually increase my leading to make it even more readable. Now if I go too far, there might be too much space, and that's going to be hard to read too, because now I'm going down here. That might actually cause more eye fatigue, or it might cause people to not read the next line properly. So we also have to be careful about that. Once again, metrically, there is auto. You can put it on, and it'll take care of it for you. However, optically or visually, aesthetically, a designer might come across and say, you know what, I want it to be a little bit more leading that I feel will visually give it better presentation, better readability, better legibility, whatever the case is. So we have to keep that in mind as well. So that's important. Now, here with this type, obviously it was actually the same type size. So let's go back and make this 12 again. Both typefaces, both fonts are 12 point, but obviously this is bigger. We have to look at how the typefaces interact with the columns and the structure that we currently have. And if we look at this O compared to, I'm actually going to copy that O next to this O, there's a big difference. But look, they're both 12 point. All right, so typefaces are definitely type pairing, and understanding your typefaces and your fonts and all that is very good to know. And being comfortable with a certain typeface and using it over and over and over again is a great idea, because you're very familiar with how it works. But using different ones is always great to experiment with as well. So instead of this situation, well, this type is really big, and even though I could look across and say, okay, this is one of my longer lines, it's 46. Now that's not a bad reading type, but you know what, I want to make it a little bit smaller to get a better line length. So maybe now I'm bringing down my type size, and it's at 11 now, and I'm at 51, so I'm definitely closer to that 60 mark that I might want to get to. So let me try that one more time, bring it down to 10, and where might I be if I go to my longest line? I'm at 51. Okay, now I'm getting a little bit closer, but nonetheless, now we start understanding how that works and what I need to do there. Once again, if that still doesn't work for me for whatever reason, I could play around with my column structure. If I have a small publication and I try to keep to a certain structure, that's fine, a certain grid. But if you can and you're able to say, you know what, I have to make it a little bit bigger. Let's pretend I'm making a publication for a nursing home, seniors home, elderly I'm making something that they're going to be reading, well, maybe the type size needs to be a little bit bigger. Maybe the type size needs to be a little bit bigger for a first-time reader, new to reading, whatever the case is. So maybe the type should be bigger. And so it's always good to also to make sure you design to your demographic as well. So maybe the type should be big. Well, if the type is bigger and I definitely want that readability to be there, okay, well, maybe we'll make it 12 point. But no, you know what, that makes my line length really short, and I really don't want that. So what I can do now is play around with my guides and my grid. So if I have to make my grid a little bit bigger, currently I'm making my text frames larger. So hopefully that will work out better. I'm getting to a 50, which is not bad, which is actually really good, between 45, 75 characters per line. And I should have mentioned this earlier. When I say characters per line, I'm talking about all those characters in there. So show hidden characters is an ideal way to design for any designer. Make sure you do that, type and show hidden characters. Obviously, you can hide hidden characters. And what that does, it shows us, let me get rid of the grid in the background. It shows us every character. The space is a character. Punctuation is a character. This hyphen, obviously part of the punctuation, is a character. So these are all characters. So I'm not just talking about letters. I'm not just talking about numerals. Everything on this line is a character. So it's always good to show your hidden characters so you have a better understanding, and actually they help you out quite a bit if you ever find a double space or there's an issue with sizes or whatever. I always design with my hidden characters on, always. So either way, looking at that, now what we can do is we can start to say, yeah, this is long enough, that's a pretty decent size, and I'm happy with that. So not only is it maybe changing up your typeface, changing up the point size, playing around with the leading, but it's also maybe playing around with the structure, so moving around your grid to make it work better. So maybe even this grid, I would say, you know what, maybe I should make it a 16 style grid so that I have even more flexibility, a 16 column grid, so I have even more flexibility. Let's actually try that. I'm going to go on this page, which I'm already there, just to make sure this is selected. I'm going to go to layout in margins and columns, and I'm going to go to a 16 column structure, and I'll say okay. So now 16 column structure, say, you know what, I'm going to bring that back a little bit, and I'm going to bring this over here, and I'm going to bring that back a little bit. Okay, let's look at that type size. 46, okay, that's on the low end, but once again, you can definitely move your column around. You can play around with the typeface, type sizes, play around with your leading to make it even more readable. And that is what optimal line length is, between 45 and 75 characters per length. And remember, all those characters count, and this is what it is, and this is how we work with it.